This is a 2005 Pontiac Vibe GT, and it's the forgotten hot hatchback. It has the same engine as a Lotus Elise. It was only offered with a 6-speed manual transmission, and it was as fast as a Volkswagen GTI, and yet nobody remembers it until today. Before I get started, big news, this Vibe GT is for sale, currently being auctioned live with no reserve on Cars and Bids, my enthusiast car auction website. These Vibe GTs are pretty rare, and if you've ever wanted a Lotus Elise powertrain and something a little bit more practical, this is the car. So, when you're done watching this video, click the link in the description to head over to the live auction for this Vibe GT on Cars and Bids. And you can bid on it and buy it only on carsandbids.com. So let's talk Vibe GT. In the early 2000s, Toyota and General Motors teamed up to make a small hatchback. The Toyota version was called the Matrix, the General Motors version was called the Pontiac Vibe, and they were good cars. They were attractive, practical, reasonably efficient, affordable, they offered all-wheel drive, and they sold pretty well. But the vast majority of Vibe and Matrix models were the normal one, which had a 130 horsepower four-cylinder, and it was fine, but boring. Or you could step up to this, the performance model, the Vibe GT and the Toyota Matrix XRS. They only came with a manual transmission and a 180 horsepower four-cylinder, the famous Toyota 2ZZ engine that was also used in the Elise and the Toyota Celica GTS. These Vibe GT models were exceptionally rare. Most people bought the base model, but I've tracked down this one, and today I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a tour of the Vibe GT and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Vibe GT by getting inside, and before you even enter this car, you start to realize there's a lot of Toyota to the Vibe GT. I mentioned this car was made in a joint venture with Toyota, and that becomes clear the moment you unlock the doors from a Toyota key fob, not a Pontiac one. You open the doors and you look inside, and the entire door panel is made up of Toyota switches. The door locks, the window switches, the locks, they're all from a Toyota. And as you look further in here, you will see a lot more Toyota stuff familiar to anybody who spent time in a Toyota from this era. The turn signal stalk is Toyota, same deal with the windshield wiper stalk on the other side. All of the switchgear buttons around the gauges, they're all Toyota. Same deal with the climate controls in the center control stack. Even the steering wheel comes directly out of a Toyota vehicle. It's pretty much all Toyota in this Pontiac. And I find that to be a little curious because Toyota, as we know, made the engine, the powertrain, the drivetrain, and also a lot of the interior. So what exactly did General Motors contribute to this partnership? The GM-Toyota partnership started in the 80s, but this was the very last car they made together, and that could explain why. Anyway, I'll talk more about that partnership a little bit later. Next up, onto the rest of the quirks and features in here. Okay, first up, big item in this interior, the manual transmission. Like I said, all of the Vibe GT and the Matrix XRS, the performance models, came with a 6-speed manual transmission, which of course this car has. One interesting thing about this transmission, when you shift it into reverse, it beeps. Not outside to let other people know you're in reverse, but inside to let you know that you're in reverse. Thanks for that helpful information. I already knew I was in reverse because I shifted there myself. Kind of strange. One other interesting thing when it comes to gearing and shifting in this car, you can see on the tachometer, the red line is over 8,000 RPM. That is pretty impressive for like a little front-wheel drive Toyota Pontiac hatchback, but these cars had some impressive power, and we'll get to the engine in a few minutes. Next up, some other interesting quirks in here. One is the outlets in the center control stack area. On the left, you have your normal cigarette lighter style outlet, but on the right, behind this cover, you have a household household style power outlet, which you don't see very often in center consoles, except maybe in full-size pickup trucks, but you have it here. Interestingly, you can't just plug something into this outlet. You have to plug it in and then press this little button next to the outlet, and that actually activates it and turns it on. But either way, you have a household power outlet right up front, which is kind of a cool touch. And next up, speaking of cool touches in this car, below the gear lever, instead of just making this a plastic panel, they actually put a little hidden storage compartment in here. You can open it up and see that you can stick stuff in here if you want for storage, which is of course always nice to have in a car interior. But while the interior of this car is largely Toyota and mostly pretty straightforward, there is one huge drawback, and that would be the technology. This car was on the very early forefront of in-car center screens, and it uses a pretty bad early example of one. It's just horrible. For one thing, it isn't a touch screen, so you have to use these little buttons to the sides of the screen in order to actually do anything, and that's kind of annoying. And it's just simply not all that intuitive to use. There's a lot of drawbacks to this. For instance, you're on the navigation map, you're getting directions from the screen, you want to change the radio station. Well, you have to go into the radio, completely leave behind the map, and then change your radio station, and then you can go back to navigation. So you kind of have to choose between whether you want directions or change the radio station. Not really an ideal setup. Once you're on the radio, the former navigation buttons become your radio preset. So the button with the little plus magnify that will zoom in on the map, that's now a radio preset. Of course, you go back to navigation and it goes back to its prior function, and that's the only way you can control it. These tiny little buttons that sort of double as other buttons depending on what screen you're on, because this isn't a touch screen. Of course, that's nowhere near as bad as trying to input an address into this navigation system, which is truly an unmitigated disaster. You have to use this little dial in the bottom left of this whole setup to go number by number, letter by letter to try to input your address, and it just takes absolutely forever to try to put a destination in here. It would take probably 5 minutes to program anything. You got to go house number, street, city. It's just a total disaster. But that was early 2000s navigation technology. This was a big deal having something like this at the time. By modern standards, of course, it's absolutely terrible. A couple of other interesting items in this screen. One is this maintenance section, which is actually kind of interesting. There's a little section for each type of maintenance you might do for the car, and you can input when you last did it, which can of course be helpful to guide you, let you know when it might be time for your next tire rotation, oil change, fluid flush, whatever it is. And that's kind of cool to see in there. And I think modern Toyotas still have that maintenance section in their infotainment screens. Probably my very favorite part of this infotainment setup though is the calendar. There is a calendar, and when you scroll through the years, it ends in 2020. That's the last year in the calendar, which gives you an idea about how long they thought this car would last. I actually think that is ridiculous. This was a 2005 model. The idea of it lasting 15 years isn't that crazy, and how much more memory could a couple more years of the calendar have taken up? But they didn't give it to you. They thought December 31, 2020 would be the end of all of the vibes, and so that's where the calendar stops in this car. Now, otherwise, aside from that stuff, there really isn't that much quirky and featurey in the front seat of the Vibe. Ultimately, it's just a fairly straightforward, simple Toyota, like Toyotas were back in the early 2000s. Since this is all Toyota switchgear in here, there's nothing too quirky or weird or unusual up here. It's just pretty simple. One interesting item in the owner's manual, though, I always go through the owner's manuals, and I noticed there's a section in this one telling you some labels and diagrams you might see throughout the car. One of them is this: a man with no mouth whose head appears to be a snow-capped mountain. That's supposed to signify that you're intended to put on eyewear whenever you see this diagram, so your eyes don't get fluid in them or whatever. But to me, it looks absolutely terrifying. If I saw that on the car, I'd probably just be freaked out. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the Vibe GT. And as you can see, not exactly huge back here. I have enough room to sit in the back seat, which is nice, but it's not like cavernous with lots of space for me to lie down. That wasn't really the point of the car, though. This was a small hatchback, a little bit larger than a Volkswagen Golf, and it was intended to be practical, but not like huge. It was like a city-friendly little hatchback that you might buy. Now, in the back seat, there's not really all that much going on. Nothing particularly interesting back here, nothing unusual at all, except the front passenger seat. You can see a giant warning label on the back of the front passenger seat with some very detailed instructions. All of that is just telling you that the seat folds down and you can use it as a table. You can see it's folded flat and there's a hard surface on the back of it, so you can like write on it or put a laptop on it, whatever, if you're sitting in the back or if you're parked somewhere and you just want a space that's flat to use. That giant warning label tells you all sorts of stuff about folding it down and warnings and don't do it when there's someone in the seat, whatever, but really that's just all there is. You can fold it down. That is a nice little neat trick. And next up we move on to the very best part of the Vibe GT. That would be under the hood, the engine. This is a 4-cylinder engine, makes 180 horsepower, and this was the famous Toyota 2ZZ engine, which, like I mentioned, was also used in the Lotus Elise and a few other high-performance Toyota models from this time period. Now, the cool thing about this engine was it had variable valve timing and a dual camshaft setup, which allowed it to produce more power, especially at a higher RPM, without resorting to forced induction like turbocharging or supercharging. And that's why this car has such a high redline. That dual cam action kind of shows up high in the rev range and pushes this car forward even more. You can really feel it, which you'll see me talking about during the driving portion of this video. But that is this 2ZZ engine. That was its big party trick, and that's what people loved about it. Now, 180 horsepower may not seem like too much by modern standards, but back in the early 2000s, it was just as much power as the Volkswagen GTI. And again, these came only with a 6-speed manual. This was really the performance version of this car. And the high revving nature of this engine meant you could kind of keep it geared up high in the rev range like an S2000 whenever you wanted power, and that kind of made it feel more fun. 0 to 60 for this car was in the low 7-second range, which matched or was a little better than the GTI. It was a performance hot hatchback back in the day with this rather special engine under the hood. And next up we move around back in the Vibe GT to discuss the hatchback component of this hot hatch. It was, after all, a pretty practical car, which I'm going to show you. One cool thing back here is that the rear glass could be opened separately from the tailgate itself. So if you had like something small you just wanted to throw in, didn't want to open the whole thing, you just press the hatch glass button on the key fob, as you can see, and that would pop it open, and then you could lift it open from there, and you didn't have to open the entire tailgate, just the back. Not a lot of cars do this because some extra engineering is required to make this work, but consumers love it when cars do have it, and this one did. But if you wanted to open up the full tailgate, you just unlock the doors and the key fob. There's a little latch back here, and then you could pop it open. And you can see it's pretty big back here. Like I said, a little bigger than a Volkswagen Golf, and that's especially clear in the cargo area where you have decent room, almost like small crossover size space back here, where you can put a lot of stuff as you're driving around shifting gears at 8,200 RPM. Now, one interesting thing I found back here in a little storage compartment on the side of the cargo area is the original window sticker. You can see this car stickered for around $24,000, which honestly was a pretty good deal back then, especially when you factor in the fuel economy up to 32 miles per gallon on the highway. You had a performance engine with a manual transmission, which was fun. You had a practical hatchback with usable space in the rear seat and the cargo area, and you had decent fuel economy and a Toyota powertrain for reliability, all for around $24,000. That's not bad, but what is bad on this window sticker is the fact that they charged $1,600 extra for that navigation system. Absolutely disastrous. I wouldn't pay $16 extra to have that in my car, but back then having something like that was a big deal. $1,600 was kind of the going rate. I can't believe people paid almost $2,000 for that crappy navigation system, but indeed they did. And next up, one last interesting quirk of the Vibe before I go drive it, that would be the production and creation of this car, which is a rather bizarre story. This is a little bit of a car geeky thing some people won't care to hear about, but I think it's a very interesting situation. A Pontiac that's also a Toyota. And indeed, Pontiac, that's what this is, a Pontiac Vibe. But like you've seen, it has a high-performance Toyota engine and mostly Toyota parts in the interior. So how exactly did this happen? Well, this was part of a line of cars that was made by General Motors and Toyota together. It started in the 1980s. Back then, General Motors was developing a reputation for poor reliability, and Toyota was trying to enter the US market more and more and needed some help amplifying that. So they got together. Toyota had great reliability. General Motors had a great production network. They figured, why not give it a shot? And so they made several cars together. There was the Geo Prism, which was also also the Toyota Corolla. That was made throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. There was an earlier model called the Chevrolet Nova, which was a small front-wheel drive car, which was also based on a Toyota. And there was this, the Vibe and the Matrix. Toyota had a version, Pontiac had a version, but underneath they were the same. Mechanically, they were the same, and the development costs were shared between General Motors and Toyota. Now, interestingly, the Vibe was built right here in California at the joint Toyota General Motors NUMMI facility in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, like I mentioned, this was the very last car in this Toyota General Motors partnership, and after the partnership dissolved, the NUMMI factory was sold to Tesla, where it has become the Tesla factory. So that was a pretty big come up for that factory, going from making Pontiac Vibes to making Tesla some of the coolest cars on the road. Not that these weren't cool. Interestingly, the Toyota Matrix was not built in the same factory as the Vibe. It was built in Canada, thousands of miles away from the Vibe. Even though these cars were mechanically identical and largely identical except for their bodies, they were built in two totally different factories on different sides of the continent, which seems a little bit strange. Although, the strangest part of this car, the strangest part of this whole review is that there was a version of the Pontiac Vibe sold in Japan as the Toyota Volts. Think about that for a second. Toyota and Pontiac made a car in the United States. There was a Toyota version and a Pontiac version. They decided to take the Pontiac version and sell it in Japan as a Toyota, even though there was already a Toyota being made. It made absolutely no sense, and I've always loved the ridiculousness of the Toyota Volts. A Toyota rebadged to be a Pontiac, rebadged to be a Toyota. What were they thinking? One especially interesting thing about the Volts is the Pontiac logo is mostly vertical, as you can see. It's like a big arrow pointing down. The Toyota logo is like an oval or a circle. So when they sold the Vibe in Japan as the Volts, they had to change every Pontiac logo and cram an oval Toyota logo into that space, even though it didn't really fit there initially. And it always looked kind of stupid to see a Toyota logo where a Pontiac logo was intended to go. But that's what happened in order to sell the Vibe in Japan as the Volts. I actually stumbled across a Toyota Volts in Malta many years ago, and I freaked out. I was like, oh my God, it's a Vibe, but it's a Volts. This is so cool. And I was probably the only person excited to see that car in its entire life. And so those are the quirks and features of the Pontiac Vibe GT. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Vibe GT. Believe it or not, I have always wanted to review one of these. It was basically a Toyota Corolla in terms of mechanical reliability, but then it was a hatchback, which the Corolla wasn't offered as a hatchback at the time, so it was more practical. And then there was the performance version, this car, the Vibe GT, which was like actually fast and exciting and fun to drive. And it was a pretty interesting combination of things. I actually recommended these cars to a lot of people, you know, a few years back when they were used, and I would tell people, you know, get a Pontiac Vibe. They're practical, they are reliable because they're a Toyota, but they're heavily depreciated because they're a Pontiac, and it's like the best of all worlds. And the GT model was especially special, but you never saw them because most people who wanted a car like this, they would get a GTI or they would get something else. They wouldn't, the Pontiac Vibe wasn't the first thing on their minds, but it was a pretty impressive car, just sort of the forgotten hot hatchback. Now, acceleration. You step on it, you don't get much power at the low end. That was true of all the cars with this engine. It starts to get loud around 5,000, 6,000. Now the second cam kicks in and it moves above 6,000. But you gotta keep it up there. Woo-hoo-hoo. You gotta keep it up there to get that real acceleration out of it. There it goes, yeah. And it feels pretty quick, and it is surprisingly fast at that speed. But it's just like an S2000, you have to really keep it revved up in order to get any considerable or decent power out of the car and to get any acceleration. If you're at the lower end of the rev range, you're not gonna go very fast. That was also true of the Elise. I owned a 2006 Lotus Elise. Obviously it was a lighter car than this and it had 10 more horsepower, but it still was pretty slow at the low end. You really kind of had to get it going and get into that second cam kicking in before you really felt like you were really moving. And that was kind of the secret of that car, and it's the secret of this one too. Gear lever shift action in this car is pretty good. Clutch is very easy, simple to use. Gear lever is simple to kind of figure out, put into gear, whatever. No vibration at all through the gear lever, which is unusual, especially in a car like this. The thing that I've been impressed, driving this car around all day, the thing I've been impressed by is the handling as well. It really isn't that bad for a front wheel drive hatchback that was not intended to be a performance car initially. they just sort of made a performance version because why not? It actually steers reasonably well. It's pretty well connected, and it's not that heavy of a car that you're pushing around. The steering feel could be better, but the handling itself, the way the car feels going around a corner, basically, the body roll is pretty controlled. It feels very predictable, and you kind of get the sense that you can push it basically as hard as the engine allows. It's not that fast of a car, but you can really gear down and go high in the rev range to go around a corner, which is a lot of fun. The thing about these cars is they're cheap and they're pretty enjoyable. And they're reliable, and that was the other big benefit. A lot of American cars from this time period, you just couldn't be sure that they were going to be reliable, or they would break a lot but be cheap to fix. But either way, wasn't ideal. This car, though, because of the Toyota powertrain, it really was sort of the best of all worlds. And I've always felt that the Pontiac version looked better than the Toyota version, at least in the first generation. These are interesting cars, and I'm thrilled that I had the chance to review this one. I have always kind of wanted to. The GTs were really rare. I would bet that 95% of sales were the regular base model. And that was a good car. Again, available all-wheel drive, Toyota mechanicals, it was good. But the GT is the cool one for enthusiasts. And every time I see a Vibe or a Matrix on the road, I always look, is that an XRS? Is that a GT? And it almost never is. But this one is, and it's a fun little car, and it's reasonably practical and reasonably efficient and cheap to buy and own. And so that's the Pontiac Vibe GT. This isn't a supercar, but it's certainly special. The rare, high-performance, hot hatchback that pretty much everyone forgot about, except for me, and now you. And you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Vibe GT a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Vibe looks fine. I always thought it was better looking than the Matrix, and frankly a decent looking hatchback. Obviously it's not some beautiful sports car, but it still gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is in the low 7-second range, which just gets it a 1 out of 10. Handling is okay, better than a normal Vibe, but not exactly sports car sharp, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is higher than you think, but again, not exactly sports car level, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. I think these are pretty cool. Spotting a GT badge on a Vibe is always an exciting moment, but it's still a 2000s Pontiac hatchback, and it gets a 2 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 13 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Vibe GT is fine, not incredibly loaded, but acceptable, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is average for a car like this, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is okay. The interior isn't great, but it's normal for a car like this. The powertrain is Toyota reliable, it's good enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Practicality is good given the hatchbackness, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, value, and I think these are undervalued and underrated. They're kind of fun, very reliable, and practical. It's a lot in one, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 25 out of 50. Added up in the DOUGSCORE is 38 out of 100, which places the Vibe GT here against some relevant cars. It's at the bottom of this list, even losing out to the PT Cruiser GT, although that's actually a surprisingly exciting car. The Vibe GT is a fun hatchback. It's no Golf R or Focus RS, but it's practical and it's a thrill for the money.